Susie Orbach is a practising psychotherapist who co-founded the Women's Therapy Institute in London in 1976. She has written many, many books about psychotherapy and about eating behaviours and self-esteem, including On Eating, Bodies, Towards Emotional Literacy, and with her longtime collaborator Louise Eichenbaum, books about women and their feelings and relationships with each other, women friends, their loving relationships and with themselves. But I would like to start with the international phenomenon that is your book, Fat is a Feminist Issue, Susie. First published in 1978, now in a new edition. This book helps women to try and make sense of the messages they've absorbed from society, which have caused troubled eating. And so to kick us off, I think that's a really useful phrase. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit about troubled eating?
Well, let me say first, I wish I didn't have to talk about troubled eating, but I think what we're now experiencing, and it's a very, very different picture than when I originally wrote Fat as a Feminist Issue, which I will now refer to as Fifi, because it's a mouthful. And it's not the kind of mouthful that gives you that satisfaction. But I think we've now reached a state of play where girls and increasingly boys are growing up quite worried about their appetites, not really knowing what it's okay to eat. By the time girls are about 6 or 7, they're already transacting in the playground in the UK around cosmetic surgery app games, sort of preparing their bodies for how they're going to look when they're older, and being very fearful of food on the one hand, and desperately interested in the other. And nursery schools now, appallingly, are giving rules to parents. For example, the nursery school of somebody I know quite well said they don't even allow them to have cake on their birthdays. They only have those Japanese models, which, look like a cake, because God forbid you should be having fat and sugar. And we've now got a society that's saturated, really, with terror about food, at the same time as we've got most gorgeous food cultures operating. And we've got a visual culture which is much more present than when I wrote Fat as a Feminist Issue, which in those days they used to estimate something like 5,000 ads that we'd see a week of what was then in those days called visually enhanced bodies. Now it's uncountable. I mean, it's impossible to know. And not only that, young people know how to reframe images for themselves. So they're part of the production of these bodies that actually don't exist.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because those constructed images for Instagram are almost seen as advertisements for themselves or for a product that they might be sponsored. But there's no real connection between that pretend image and what they actually look like, or how they feel about what they look like.
Well, I think here's the relationship, Kaz, I think, and maybe you'll understand this working with young people in a different way, but coming at it, is that I think they're on a search to have a body that they can feel comfortable about. So the constructive images that go onto Instagram, where they're seeking, in a survey in the UK, it showed they were seeking 126 likes and only managed to receive 24. So they would bring them right down. That's after having constructed an image, which would take quite a lot of time. So I think that the constructive image is a way to say, well, actually, look, maybe I can pass in this world of kind of visual fascism where I'm supposed to look like this. So it's a hope and a longing, but obviously it's very disturbing, and it's part of what fuels troubled eating and a troubled relationship to their bodies.
And it seems to me that not all, but many young girls want to be told what to look like. They're looking for the rules. And if we don't talk to them about the idea of them being themselves and different ways of being, then we're kind of leaving them out there on this battlefield to be bombarded with, as you say, thousands more images.
Well, they are going to be bombarded. I think the question is, what can we do as an antiviral agent? How can parents, particularly, because the culture hits the parent, and the parent is as affected by the horrors of the dominant visual constructed culture. So how do we help parents, particularly new mums, not pass on their own body anxieties to the next generation, but invite their children, boys and girls, to see their bodies as a place they live from, a place to extend themselves rather than a place to be fearful of and watchful of. And
something that they can use and be a tool, whether it's for dancing or moving.
I think the problem is that for young people, and not really at 6, but more at 11, 12, 13, when you're having... when you're coming into adolescence, although that does seem to come earlier and earlier and earlier, literally biologically because of all the estrogens in the water, etc., but also because if you can make something, adolescence happen early, you can sell a lot more goods. But I think kids do want to be exactly the same as each other at the same time as they need to differentiate.
And be special.
Yeah, and so how do we do that in a way that doesn't play to bodies? How do we do it in a way that doesn't disturb their eating? How do we do it in a way that talks about engagement and cooperation and facilitating, I mean, not the brownies, for God's sake, because that was, something far too, I was never allowed to join because I came from a family that thought it was far too colonial and imperial and I wasn't allowed it.
Oh, hippies.
No, leftists. But how do we find a way of instilling something that is a counter to that you're selling yourself as a product, you're selling yourself as a thing to be taken up? That's the only way you have a place in our society.
Well, that's one of the things that I love about, if I may, Fifi, because it then and it now in the new edition, it does have some very practical ideas about ways of thinking and also very practical ways of dealing with the reality of food and what you're eating and why. So in helping to be that antiviral agent, is it mostly about changing what's inside those kids, or is it in a way teaching them how to build a suit of armour from the knowledge?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's two things. I think if we can in our own households just neutralise food, just have lots of delicious different kinds of food, and have a mantra that's, not one that we say every 2 seconds, but one that indicates that you eat when you're hungry, you really relish your food, and you stop when you're full. If that is the general thing, rather than good foods and bad foods, that is one way of building an internal confidence in the capacity to feed yourself. And then if you'd apply that, if you like, to, well, if I'm feeling sad, it's not so terrible to cry. If I'm feeling confused, well, then I need to put on my thinking cap or whatever. In other words, if you apply the same kind of idea of you have an emotion and it needs to be responded to, not cut off, not over-expressed, not under-expressed, I think that gives you much more of the antiviral agent for going out into the world.
A lot of people talk, that phrase, having work done, or she's had work done, to speak about cosmetic surgery. And it seems...
Yeah, how did it get to be work? I mean, I guess it's work for the cosmetic surgeons, and I guess it's work for the women to go against their own bodies. But actually, there are deadly aspects to that work. I mean, labiaplasty now...
which is genital mutilation.
For girls... is one of the things that our National Health Service is trying to fight against, because girls are coming in feeling that their genitals are deformed because they don't look like the received idea about what a labia should look like, which is all tucked up and neat. None of us have tucked up. Well, maybe some of us do.
Often from digitised images in
and
porn
also
that
from the images of 11 and 12-year-olds who don't have developed labias, who have a little slit and something ever so hidden, because that's what it was at that point. So I've forgotten the question that led me to the work.
I didn't get to it, Susie.
No,
I didn't get to it.
I'm so sorry, Kaz.
No. But that's exactly why, because I knew you would be interested in those words and how misleading it can be. And where I was going is that actually doing psychotherapy or reading a book like Fifi and thinking about food and feelings and how they intersect, that's actually doing work. And I was going to say to you, is it something that takes bravery for people to do you think?
I think it's a risk to go outside the cultural story. And I think for young people, it's much better if they engage with these ideas collectively or in groups. And Endangered Bodies, which is an activist group that I'm part of that actually exists in Australia, as well as London and New York and Sao Paulo. And
so Endangered Bodies?
Yep. .org, please look it up. Has a whole project called Shape Your Culture for younger people to get involved in together and to not just understand how the nefarious industries are working on us or how seductive they are, but what to do yourself to be engaged in a different kind of way and be transformative. So I think it is that piece as well.
It's quite a radical act, actually, to think that, because what you're up against is, big...
Somebody didn't turn their phone off.
Yes, you bastards. Pull yourself together. And now they're going to be too scared to get it out and check. There's big fashion, there's big sugar, there's big pharma, there's big herbal...
there's the diet industry, for God's sake, which
yes.
of course is the food industry in another guise.
The only way that the dieting industry, if we will call it that, can make money
is by failure.
Is if it fails.
95
if the fairy tale is not true.
Correct, because if dieting worked, you'd only have to do it once. It doesn't work. It's therefore you need to be a repeat customer.
So tell me what you think of the idea of perhaps the world's best-known yo-yo dieter, Oprah Winfrey.
I feel very bad that she's done this. But here's how I think about what Oprah's doing. I think she feels so unsafe. She's been quite honest about that in relation to her own food intake and what food means to her, that she actually requires the straitjacket of a commercial venture. I mean, we saw it with Sarah Ferguson, who was once married to a prince in my country. And she tried to do that, right? She became the face of Weight Watchers for a while. It didn't actually work. But Oprah's older, and maybe it will work for her.
Well, it will work and then it won't work, and then it will work and not work.
But she's the spokesperson, she's a face, and maybe that will help. What worries me much more about Weight Watchers is the way it's being sold into China, into Turkey, into Korea. We're exporting body hatred as some kind of way to enter modernity in global capitalism. And this seems to me a very, very vicious form of undermining. It's bad enough we're selling our body shape over there in all these countries, but now we're also selling the way that we don't know how to look after our bodies, which is through diets.
Yes.
I mean, and
have this mistake we prepared earlier.
And processed non-food foods, which of course go along with the dieting industry. They of course use those, but the food industry itself is absolutely criminal in the way it produces the bliss point in foods that actually don't exist by their use of the crunchy, the sort of pretend fatty feeling that's all suspended in plasticizers and the salts and the sugars. Those things are very worrying. I'm pushing this away. I'm taking some water because I've talked too much.
Right. I'll take over. And also, I was in China a couple of years ago and hadn't realised till I saw it everywhere there, huge billboards of white Western people selling skin bleaching cosmetics by all the same big companies that we see here. So instead of the Lancome ad with Hermione Granger, what's her name? Emma Watson on it, saying buy this makeup, it would say make your skin whiter. And then here we are
making ourselves browner.
Yeah. It's pretty weird.
Yes, but I mean, it's a win-win for the corporate world, or for vulture capitalism, as I think Anthony Lowenstein, one of your critics, writes. But it isn't a win-win it's a social disaster for people. And the other thing about going to China is these enormous billboards of Western women selling back to Chinese women the clothes that are created in the Chinese factories but badged with these Western brands, and selling the badge, or selling the how can I put this? Selling the brand of woman, which is to look a certain kind of way, and to disappear the Chinese body off the out of that consciousness, as though there's something wrong with the way their height or their breasts or their bottoms or their eyes are. And
well, in the same way that the diet industry only works if it doesn't work, that's the only way they make money. The only way they make money out of us is to make us feel terrible about ourselves. So we buy a product to defrizz our hair,
well, that some of us do need. Yeah, it isn't that product, is it? It's the fact that it's our belief, and I can be as vulnerable as the next person, that you actually need the mascara that automatically turns itself. I mean, who needs that? But for 1 minute or for 20 minutes, you have that longing. And I don't know if it's true in Melbourne, but in London now, in the department stores, there used to be a sort of reasonable-sized cosmetic section. It is now almost the whole floor. And I bet within 20 years, the basement floor will be that for men, because we've seen, they've gone to younger and younger ages. They've gone to global culture to sell these brands. Now I think they're going to boys and men in a very big way. Yeah,
I think they are too. One thing I wanted to ask about the reissue of Fifi.
Yeah, it's not really a reissue. It's just got a new essay in the front.
So it's a
long essay in the front.
It's a reintroduction.
Yes.
So is that because, and I could relate to this if it's true, is that because you reread it and said, this is all still useful and all still relevant? Or was there anything that you said, that didn't turn out to be...
The only thing that I don't like in Fifi, and it's had loads of new intros over its very long life, is that I use the word fat as an idea of a state of mind rather than fat as literally adiposity. So when I say it, I mean it in the sense that women imagine themselves to be fat, or the ideas that are associated with fat or thin. I actually have to be honest with you, Kaz. I didn't reread the book this time. I just felt enough. But
how many years?
It's 38, so I must have written it 39 years ago. And yeah. Okay.
I think you'd know it pretty well.
I knew it then, and some of the ideas that I developed, which are in bodies or are in the introduction in a different way. But I've also just done the new introduction to bodies, which will be coming out. So I guess this is a sorry to me. This is of no pleasure to me that this book is in print.
And still necessary.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is fascinating about a book that's been around for that long is that you... I wonder how people react to you, because those words have been very important to people in their lives. And now there are more people saying similar things, thankfully, and people are saying it in podcasts and in TV shows. But I wonder whether the success of the book and the message made you feel that you had to adjust yourself, or how people saw you. Did you have people flinging their arms around you and saying you've changed my life, or writing you letters that made you cry?
Yeah. The thing is, I've got a day job. I'm actually a clinician who sees all sorts of problems. And Fifi was my attempt to share what I'd understood from a political analysis and a psychological analysis of what I saw in the consulting room. And my sanity is sharing those things with the wider public. So that's what goes on for me. And the fact that I've been able to touch people, well, obviously I'm so privileged and it really moves me. But it feels to me like it's a relationship, really. It's you write, when I write, it's a love letter. And it's a love letter to you or to to everybody, because otherwise, why the hell would I do it? And so if it can be received, then that's very moving.
So you don't have to hide in the streets?
When I was doing the Guardian column, I did have that funny experience of sitting in the coffee shop and people going. But you know what? It's not that kind of level of fame. And there's so many celebrities in the world that the fact that you're actually a psychotherapist who happens to have written, or a broadcaster, yeah, you're making an offering. And so what? What's more important is the offering you're making.
Just to take you back, because I'm fascinated with that idea of the way that the word fat has changed or been used in different ways. And I know that you have written about the way it's now, well, it's used as an insult.
It's demonized, it's a moral category.
And what do you think that's about? Is that about our eyes being trained to see one kind of beautiful, or is it about the idea that people who are large have lost control and therefore should be...
Oh, I think it's so much. I think it's the fact that thin is aspirational, and so many women, particularly women with eating problems, don't look like they have eating problems, and they feel so relieved that they're not like the ones whose eating problems show, which are the fat people. But actually there's a continuity between them and them, so there's not really a difference. And, so the fat people are on the other side of the tracks, and I've managed to get on this side of the track.
Right, so I can feel a little bit better about the fact that
I think it relates to the undermining of all of our appetites and all of our longings. And it's also part of the neoliberal project of we are responsible for ourselves, we're responsible for our health. Forget the fact that we've got the biggest carbon figures today. Forget the fact that most cancers are caused by the environment. It's all up to us. That is part of the health ideology, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, and also that everything has to make a profit. So
thin and well-being, all of those things which we might want to deconstruct, because actually it isn't necessarily healthier to be thin. That's not what the National Institutes of Health show in the United States. If you're going to use a BMI, it shows at 27.5, which is in the middle of the overweight category, is the healthiest. But that doesn't even take into account people who are going up and down, or not eating or eat. But yes, it's a very, very... So the fat thing has become a form of disdain and self-disdain. It's a
moral judgment.
That part of me that can't bear my own longings, which is projected onto the other, I'm able to control for the moment, and therefore I can hate the other. I mean, it's absolutely a non-interesting way of relating to self and other.
I really want to go back to problem pages too, because I've been a problem columnist as well, and I'm kind of addicted to reading them. I'm always interested to know what people are writing about and what the columnist is saying. And I listened to a BBC podcast recently with you, and I think she was a TV agony aunt called Vanessa Feltz.
Yeah, was I ever on her program? Yeah.
You went on her program, but you were on BBC Radio, and so was she, talking about the notion of confession.
Oh, yeah. In an intellectual program we were discussing.
Yeah, and it's great searching you, Googling you. There are all sorts of lovely things pop up that you can listen to. But I think it was Vanessa saying on that program that, and she was very sure of herself, she said that people write to a problem columnist because they want to be told not to do it. Don't have the affair, don't marry the bloke who's got 3 children that you don't like. Whatever it is, I'm against it, in the words of Groucho Marx. And I wondered how you see the role of a public, it's not exactly, I know it's not a public psychotherapist, but a public problem receiver.
Well, I was an agony columnist, but for a very short time. My columns in The Guardian were nothing to do with that. My columns in The Guardian were much more about emotional literacy and politics.
And there's a couple of great books that have come out.
Yeah, so
that.
I'm not sure what the role of a public psychotherapist is. Look, the psychotherapist hears the secrets of society as experienced by the individual, by the family, by the mother-daughter relationship, by the couple. That's what we hear. We hear what people have hard time articulating. We have enormous insights and knowledge, and a knowledge base which we could give to social policy makers. We understand why women find it hard to leave men who are battering them. Not because they're idiots, or again, with fact, not because we're idiots that we buy those things, but because we imagine we're doing something that's protective or okay or looking after or will make us safe. So those kinds of insights could be brought into social policy in a really important way. So that's one aspect of a public psychotherapist. The other is to talk about the kinds of problems that are going on and the way they get translated into political issues. Britain has never, for example, managed to accept the fact that it's a small country that has relatively little power in the world. So instead...
Oh, they're quite furious about it.
So now we've got Brexit, for God's sake, going on, and pretending that we're a really important country that can... and we must keep all those non-white people out who are coming to us.
Johnny foreigners, I believe, is the technical term.
And it's a very interesting... It's like we're not situated in the current historical moment. We haven't understood the world is on the move. We haven't understood that actually post-war Britain and the loss of all the colonies, as I think they were called, requires people to rethink the relationship. But we've been sold a different sort of story. So I think a public psychotherapist has things that they can say far less crude than I'm saying now, because I'm only sort of skimming, but are about those kinds of issues and about what the hell is going on when you have warring factions, when you have gangs. There's things that we can understand about the difficulty of actually managing difference between each other and differences that we inside of ourselves that we like, that we suppress and can't manage.
That brings me to a quote. Well, I hope it's a quote of yours. I read it online. We shall fight them on the beach. No, that's not right.
No, that wasn't me.
No.
I wasn't even alive. Even though this book is very old, I wasn't alive.
This one is, I'd like to see much more understanding of emotional issues around hurt, abandonment, disappointment, longing, failure and shame, where they stem from, and how they drive people and policies brought into public discourse.
That sounds pretty good.
I know, well done you.
Because I think I was making the argument that I don't want to just focus on the grand emotions like love and hate. I think that maybe it's age, but I think we've got more complexity than that. And, football or opera often deal with the very grand emotions, don't they? Or the simplification of our emotions. And we do need that, but we also need the texture of what we're feeling.
The emotions in between, the nuances
Absolutely.
in between. And I'm fascinated, leading on from that idea about, the public psychotherapist being able to deal with, the little made big, if you like. Can you see in public policy, aside from Brexit and perhaps Donald Trump comes in here, but what...
I hope not.
Yes. But what are the public manifestations of things like guilt and shame, do you think, that you
Well, you see, I think
see?
The problem is we have kind of disavowed guilt. We have disavowed... If you think...
That we're not supposed to have... You shouldn't feel guilty about anything? Is that what you mean?
I don't even think it's that conscious. Because I think the thing the psychoanalysts understand, and most of us really understand it, is that we don't really know ourselves. And what I mean by disavowed is, it isn't that we feel guilty and we've decided we're not going to feel guilty. It's a kind of split-off emotion. We don't know what we feel sometimes, and because we don't take the extra beat to find out, then when we feel threatened by a 9/11, we don't think deeply enough about it. We just think, we're invited to think by the leadership of our nations, right, let's kill the bastards. Don't think like, what the hell is going on here? What is this? And what can we make of it? And therefore, what kind of response do we really need to do? And I know that sounds as superficial as go kill the bastards, but there is a whole area to be thought of in terms of what does it mean when we're under attack? We are very frightened, but we're also excited by it. We're also interested in what it is. And that kind of bit of the conversation gets closed down. Sounds
a bit like you've just described North Korea, actually. To keep the place in a constant idea that you're at war.
Well, I think that's Naomi Klein's idea, is that,
Oh, is it? I nicked it, sorry.
No, it's not. It's okay. No, she really talks about Katrina, which was in New Orleans, and I think the environmental issues are very interesting as a kind of shock therapy in which all sorts of policies are brought in following a disaster that manage not the expectations of people, but demonize the people who are actually in difficulty, and to go back to demonization, and then redraw the boundaries of the policies, the social policies in those areas. So New Orleans now has luxury housing, for example, instead of rebuilding for the population that was there.
So what we're told and what feels like an increase in anxiety and depression is met with, for example, today in the news, a story that 1 in 10 Australians is taking antidepressant medication, which doesn't sound like it can be quite right. Maybe it's 1 in 10 adults. Otherwise, that would be almost every...
You just cut the population in half because you cut out the children, so it's really 1 in 5.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And I think what was interesting about today's report, that's not new information in terms of the role of pharma, but what was fantastic about it was showing that the efficacy of it, they don't work for most people.
Yeah.
And that actually CBT therapy only works for few people. That you
so cognitive behaviour therapy.
That you may actually have to allow people to talk and be listened to. Before,
sorry, everyone. She's
before
just gone right off now.
Before you go to... Yeah. Yeah. So, look, we've seen the role of pharma, and it's mendacious.
So how...
And that's not to say that depression is okay. It's very troubling. Anxiety and depression, or repetitive behaviors that you can't get out of, or hearing voices that you don't know how to manage. Emotional isolation is absolute hell. I don't want to underestimate the anguish and the hurt of it all. But it doesn't necessarily get dealt with by a pill.
Yeah, or the idea that there is a quick fix, and then it and that comes back to the idea of psychotherapy and looking at yourself and your relationship to the world is work. It is it can be, but it can be really good work that goes on for a long time with it.
It's really interesting to be curious about yourself. In the same way, it's really interesting to be curious about literature. To find things in writing that allows you to extend the possibilities for yourself and to find yourself there. I don't think psychotherapy is the only way that people can surrender and discover things about themselves that they don't know. I think there are many other forms, but psychotherapy is a damn good one, actually, and it's very, very interesting.
One thing that you do when you talk about psychotherapy in some of your books, and one that I hadn't seen until very recently, is called The Impossibility of Sex. And it's about a psychotherapist's response to her patients. And they're not real patients, they're fictional,
they're not even
entirely made
they're
up.
Totally imaginary. And they come to see this imaginary therapist called Susie, who's a very idealized version of me. Now, in that sense, I was following some literary figures who write about themselves, right?
That is such a brave book, though.
It is. I like that book.
Wow. I was reading it actually by myself going, oh, and wow, because I love the way the psychotherapist called Susie is so honest about her reactions to patients who might be fiercely flirty or really troubled, and then they just take off. So you don't know necessarily whether they're okay. And you talk about how a psychotherapist feels great compassion, and I haven't finished it yet, but I'm wondering if there's a point at which the psychotherapist just shouts at someone to pull themselves together, or is that one step over the line?
I don't think that's therapy. I mean,
she's a professional.
I think what I wanted to do in that book was many things. One, I wanted to show the craft of therapy and the aesthetic of it. But I really wanted to show the beating heart of the therapist and the intellectual work that goes on.
Yeah.
And the connection and the way in which every therapy encounter challenges, affects, and moves the therapist, or at least the therapist called Susie in this book.
Yes.
And that there's a part of you that might think, oh, for God's sake, pull yourself together. Or, do you know what I went through last night? You might be having that in your mind. But that is such a small piece of what's going on, because you're underneath and trying to engage with the way they're impacting on you. And if, in fact, you do feel, why don't you pull yourself together, then you're reflecting on, so what was the message that they experienced, that they had to pull themselves together before they could even articulate what the difficulty was when they were growing up or at school or whatever.
It was fantastically complex, but explained, or not explained, but told in such a lovely human way. I thought it was fantastic. And what I haven't heard yet is there's a new radio show that you've been involved in called In Therapy.
Yeah, I just made a series. Well, they went out in, I think, February. You can download them if you go to bbc.co.uk, Radio 4. And look either In Therapy or Susie Orbach. And they are, again, they're a bit like Impossibility, but in this case, they were actors who improvised on very little information.
How long is each session?
15 minutes. And I don't know any more information than it's a 60-year-old man with two failed marhaving. He's a trade unionist.
So it's not a script?
No, there's no script. Or a couple who are have had having a difficult time in their relationship, and maybe it mirrors something about their history. Or there's a woman who's come from exile, if she's exiled from her country and the impact of loss on her. Or a 30-year-old who doesn't know who the hell she is, even though she's very accomplished and she's a lawyer and this, that, and the other. So they come into the room, and I may have been seeing them for a fictional amount of sessions, like 6 times or 18 months worth.
Wow.
And they'd come in and we start the session, and thank God it works, because the therapist doesn't start the session, the patient or the analyst or the client has to. And that's how we go. And then so we made them for 25, we recorded for 25 minutes, cut them down to 15.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask. Did it take 3 hours to get the 15 minutes?
No, not at all. And then we did voiceovers, or I did a voiceover after I cut them, to explain a little bit what was going on, or what my thinking was. And now I've just finished the book of those, which will be out in November, called In Therapy. And so that looks like a play script, which is then annotated with why I said what I said when this was going on, or what I felt when this was going on, or I might have a whole long discursive thing into what dissociation means or something. So a bit like Impossibility, except as a play script.
Yeah.
I think you'll like that.
I think I will too. You just love it so much, don't you? This is, you. How many patients do you see a day?
8, 7 or 8.
That's a pretty.
And I supervise the work
work.
of others, so that's a lot more actually as a result.
Yeah.
I mean, I've gotten so long in the tooth that when somebody wants to come for supervision, I'll say, yeah, but you can only bring me 1 or 2 people. You can't bring me more, because I actually cannot fall in love with that number of people and take them into my heart and think about them.
Oh, well, thank heavens it's you doing it and feeling that way. It's actually very moving to read about.
Thank you.
To read about you, but also to meet you. And I didn't think you'd be a shocking charlatan, Susie, but I'm thrilled to find that you're quite lovely. One thing that I was wondering, with you having to, I guess, interact with the actors and, them improvising, which I guess is
their job,
and weird, but kind of not unlike what it's like for you when a patient comes anyway. You don't know what they're going to say. So how do you feel about fictional therapists in movies and TV? Do you have a favourite? The Jennifer in The Sopranos? Do you...
I'm such a snob. I mean, it's fine, but I don't watch that much TV.
I don't know where you'd have the time.
Well, that's the problem. So if I am watching TV, I basically go for a rom-com or some schmaltzy thing like that, or, documentary. I remember Barbara Streisand in Prince of Tides 100 years ago, and I remember her crossing her legs the whole time, and I kept thinking, that must be very distracting for the people. So I'm not sure I have a favorite therapist, I'm sorry. And I suppose what I think is that what goes on in those series is, I was once married to a physicist, and he would go out of his mind when Russell Crowe would be doing equations on the board in A Beautiful Mind. Every mathematician and physicist they just hate it. How can you reduce the beauty, the aesthetic, the depth, the understanding of the natural world to not even real equations, even if they brought in a proper physicist or mathematician? And that's kind of how I feel about therapy. It's a fiction. That isn't how we are. We're so much richer than that.
Susie, I just wanted to ask a quick question, because I know you live with a writer.
I don't.
Oh, you don't?
I have a relationship. I might even be married.
What an assumption. I thought you were married. So
I am married, but that doesn't... We live 2 hours away from each other.
How perfect. I am so jealous. That's great.
In fact, travelling together on this trip is, a lot. We're spending every minute together, except when she's doing another Wheeler Centre event as we speak. So
Jeanette Winterson is Susie's wife, not Gloria Steinem, who's also in town.
So that's a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody imagines that, we sit around the table and have really fascinating, deep conversations the whole time. When we're together, it's entirely domestic. But we're not... you
don't give each other work and hand each other a red pencil?
No, I don't. But we are... Jeanette loved The Impossibility of Sex a long time before she met me.
Ah.
And she always wanted to write a riposte called The Possibility of Love. So we have that.
Oh,
we're planning to do that together.
Oh, that's a great idea.
So hopefully, if we can find some time.
You're up to Pussy's bow. You've got a lot going on. No wonder you don't...
And I'm very old.
No wonder you don't have a boxed set habit. Yes, the question up the back.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk, Susie. I'm just wondering, in your therapy, have you come across many children of the 1950s where we all had to finish and eating everything on our plate? Because I, got out of that habit, I thought, until somebody sprung me just a couple of days ago trying to finish something that I didn't feel like eating. And also, too, I wonder if we can get stuck in how we can get women, young girls, to stop wearing makeup, tell them they look beautiful without it.
Well, yes, of course. I grew up with that too. Not exactly that, because my father had grown up with, if you didn't eat it that time, you got it the next time. But that was out of poverty rather than out of... I never understood the whole thing of how it was helping those poor starving children in China. I never got that.
Mine were in India.
Right. Well, so that's one thing. I think we need to change it so we can say, yeah, that was what your parents were able to do at that time, and it didn't work for you. So perhaps you could give that up for yourself and perhaps not impose it on anybody else. They didn't mean to be doing the wrong thing. It just didn't work. What was the second bit of the question?
How can we stop making girls wear makeup?
Oh, I think we should treat it as total play and rather than anything else, because I don't think it works to say don't do it. I think all it says is, oh, when you do that, you look like this or something, or when you do that, you look like that. And just make it like another kind of imaginative thing. Let's do some makeup on the page and get the drawing out, because it's fine to learn how to transform yourself. The problem is getting stuck in that as being the only way you can be alive. Yeah,
I agree with that. And also the idea that makeup is the idea of looking better. I know when I did the research for girl stuff, and I did a survey of about 4,000 girls, and a lot of them said they hated makeup, and a lot of them said they loved it because it was fun. And what I did was I did a list of movies that had great costume and makeup that showed an era or an idea or the future. So there was another reason for the makeup. So, but I absolutely know where you're coming from. And there's got to be enough. Oh, look, there's someone down in the front row. There's wherever you like.
There's a couple of people down the front row.
Hi, Susie. Thank you for that. I haven't heard you talk before or read any of your books.
I can't actually see
Can you hear me? Can you see me now?
Yes.
I haven't heard you talk or read your books, but my niece has told me a lot about you, and she has benefited a lot from your work. What I was going to ask you, I think you said something about the neoliberal project, and I was just interested, what do you see as the role of self? And choice and empowerment.
How many hours do we have?
And empowerment. You know, I think part of psychotherapy is about empowering
Yes
people.
and no, right?
Yeah.
Because, of course, it's like the theft of these words, and they're so overused that it's very hard for them to have the depth and the sense of struggle that empowerment or being able to choose not to do something that's hurtful means. I think the problem with the neoliberal project is we're sold choice as something, and it turns out to be a tyranny, because there are probably 70 brands of lipstick on sale. That's not choice, that's craziness, and yet that is how choice is represented to us. So of course I believe in the struggle to discover the self, but I also think the self is an outcome of relationship, and is a deeply social self, as well as being an individual private self. So the self of psychotherapy and the self that we take into the world are selves who are looking for agency and as a way to act and to connect with others and to be recognized and to contribute. And so I think that's how I think about it, which is rather different than the neoliberal project, which turns yourself into a self who you can sell and who you can brand and who you can, and I'm sure you don't mean it that way.
Hi, my name's Zoe. I'm a dietitian. I actually contacted you, Susie, probably several months back to see if I could use a quote from your Bodies book on my website, which you generously allowed me to do, so thank you for that. This might be more of a comment than a question, but I was curious to know whether you were aware of more and more dietitians, particularly in Australia, using something called the non-diet approach and the concept of intuitive eating.
Yeah, of course I am, and I'm thrilled.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like that better than what I came up, which was the anti-diet. I love the non-diet approach, yes.
Yeah, so all about helping people heal their relationship with food and their bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
She's right here.
Susie, I'm interested in your ideas about practicing psychotherapy with people with an eating disorder, diagnosed eating disorder, particularly anorexia nervosa. There's a notion that really often people aren't available to psychotherapy, and I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I don't think it's easy working with people diagnosed with anorexia. That's nervosa, that's what the question was about. I've written a whole book about it myself a long time ago, because in the groups that we ran at the Women's Therapy Centre, inevitably women came who were anorectic, who were desperate to lose even more weight and to get through compulsive eating. Yeah, those two contradictions. And out of that, I wrote The Hunger Strike and tried to understand what the anorexia was a solution to. In other words, looking at it not as the problem at all, but as the solution. Of course, it is a problem because it's so debilitating, and starvation is not good for you. There are so many women now with undiagnosed anorexia who are kind of walking around trying to manage themselves. I just think the clinicians aren't trained well enough. I think there's a tremendous amount of envy that goes on in hospital settings. I think a lot of, this is not to cast aspersions on the nurses and therapists, but they'd like to catch a little bit of anorexia is the way they see it, which is to show how ignorant they are about what's actually going on. So do I think it's plausible for the listening cure? Because I do think actually therapy is about the listening cure as much as it is about the talking cure. Yes, I do think it's plausible, but I don't think it's an easy way out. But neither do I think the revolving door of being fed up and then going out into the community and coming back again once you've not been able to manage, is a particularly efficient way or a profound enough way of helping young women and young men or older people in trouble in this kind of way.
I'm sure Susie would agree with this too. Today the funding was cut for the Butterfly Foundation's eating disorder helpline in Australia. So anybody here who's interested could probably go to the Butterfly Foundation website today or tomorrow and find out where the petition is to sign it, in the hope that the treatment and the psychotherapy and the medical help at the other end of a referral is something that we should hope for, and hope for better training. But it's important to keep...
Well, why not, charge the food companies and the media style industry? Look, we didn't have anorexia in this number 40 years ago. When I started my work, it was very, very rare to see people with anorexia. And it wasn't that it was just hidden, It didn't exist in these numbers. So there's been an explosion. It's not genetics, for God's sake. It is to do with the complete destruction and the undermining of women's relationship to food, which then gets passed in very intricate and intimate ways in the family, and it makes us all very vulnerable to these very troubled bodies and troubled eating. And I think we should have a levy on some of the people who inadvertently, if we want to think about it, cause these problems, so that places like Butterfly and the proper training of people is possible, and we shouldn't have scarce and scant resources for the treatment of these difficulties.
I agree. Well, I think we can start with the people who sit in the front row of a fashion show and watch all those poor girls walk past them looking so ill and don't get up and
But also,
say anything.
What a crazy thing. You're walking in a fashion show as though you're on display, as opposed to doing a job. I mean, most of us do jobs, but we are encouraged to think of ourselves as looking at ourselves from the outside while we're doing our job. I mean, it's insane. You're a lab technician. You need to be looking at yourself, doing while you're doing it.
Susie, sorry. If you were able to influence public policy from a preventative approach with dieting and the culture that we live in today, what sort of angle would you take?
Yes, fix that, would you?
What? I'd fix it, yeah. I think I'd start with a project that I am involved in, which might sound a weird way to start, but this is where I do it. I'd start with pregnant mums who have their own difficulties, who've, as we've been saying, have been under the cosh of all of these industries, and whose pregnancies and post-pregnancy period are now being arced by control of the body by outside sources, whether it's, to have C-sections and tummy tucks at the same time, or think they have to be kind of having their bodies back immediately after they've given birth. So I would be starting with them to try to actually talk to them about the magic of reproduction and that time, and to help them to recognize that they are transmitting something about bodies to the next generation. That we know that everybody accepts, I think, that you get your mind from your parents, but we don't really accept that we get our body sense of ourselves from our parents. So it would be a way of getting two populations in one. And you could look up a paper I wrote for the government called Two for the Price of One. With my colleague Holly Rubin on the UK government website. And this is a training program for midwives and health visitors, despite the fact that all they can do these days is in the UK is tell them all about the procedures rather than... But there's an attempt to start there. I would then go to the school teachers who are no less under assault and try to talk to them about reformulating their notions about good and bad foods, and talking really about appetite and satisfaction and relishing food and knowing about hunger and knowing about stopping. And I'd prosecute the diet industry for false advertising.
It's been marvellous. Your spirit really comes through in the way that you speak and the way that you write, and it's been a privilege for us all here to hear you this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our guest, Susie Orbach.
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.